start recording. All right. So, and feel free to follow along if you want. So, because again, CSS, HTML, just it's more like the more hands-on experience you get doing it. Like that's pretty much most of the times where you learn is like the hands-on doing, especially with front-end work. So here
to get the HTML template to show up.
So there's a couple ways to do that. You can literally just type in bang and you get like a pretty decent HTML template to show up. So just the exclamation point should work. Also, if you just type in HTML, depending on what snippets you have available or have installed, HTML, that also works. But yeah.
You can also hit a Command Shift L and it'll open up in like your default browser as a page.
Awesome. I did not know that.
I was using the hell out of it last night.
All right. So in here, I just kind of preface that I've got a parent div and 5 child divs. And I've got a class of parent and each child and a class of child. And then also on box 2, I have an ID of Explorer. So over here, I have display flex, which we will be learning after this. It's text align center. And then each child element has the element has a height of 150 pixels, a width of 150 pixels, a background color, as well as a border. And then the Explorer, which is unique to box 2, has a background color of turquoise with a border of light sea green. So if we come over here and kind of look at what that looks like, this is what it looks like. So you'll see the position property come up occasionally, and it's actually, when you first hear about it, it's a little confusing on how to actually use it. So there's essentially 4 different position properties. So on my child element, specifically in the Explorer, I'm going to do position. I'm going to target position. And there's a few of them. There's fixed, relative, static, sticky, and absolute. It defaults to static. So if you don't have anything, it's static. You can have sticky and fixed. Those are I've never used those before, but you'll see relative and absolute more often than the other ones. So the relative, this is actually a good one. If you use position relative, this is the element. So Explorer is positioned essentially relative to itself. So if I wanted to change around the margin or padding, specifically the margin, it'll change the margin within itself. So for example, if I do margin, and if I wanted to target top margin only, how would I do that? There's a couple ways I could do that.
You would just you could just do margin top.
I can do margin, and then like 10 pixels or 15 pixels. Is there another way I can target margin top by just using the margin value?
I don't think so, because I think for a single value, it's top and bottom, and then the second value left and right. But to do just top, you have to put in 4 values.
Yep. So if I wanted just the top, I'd have to do, it starts just like a clock. It goes clockwise. 15 pixels start at the top, 0 pixels for the bottom, 0 pixels for the right side, and 0 pixels for the right or left side. So I can do that. But let's look at what happens. So notice how I get margin. It comes down that way. But maybe if I also wanted to have some margin left, 10 pixels. So it changes the positioning relative to itself. So this is the space it initially had on like the second element. And then it just margin top. It's it makes sense. It's margin to relative to itself. Now, the issue is when we bring in the absolute value. or the absolute position. So the absolute position makes it relative to its parent. So wherever the parent starts, that's where this explorer value or this explorer element is going to be, essentially where it's going to reside on the screen. So if I just do relative or position absolute, the parent div starts right here, just where box 1 is. And so if I refresh that, notice how it's covering box 1. So it's kind of like out on its own, but only within the parent div. So I can do margin, again, 15 pixels, 0, 0, 15 pixels. And now notice how like all the other boxes aren't affected by box 2 because box 2 is position is relative to the parent. What questions do you have about that? There are rare occasions where you would use absolute position. Like for example, if you had like, oh man, I wish I can find one. Like was it material UI examples? I'm just gonna come over here. What the hell? Components, example projects. SAS template maybe. No.
Question, Tom.
Yep.
Do you think absolute like has anything to do with like overlays or maybe like parallax scrolling and stuff like that as well? I mean,
I've seen it used in that area, but yeah. So yeah, it is used in those cases as well. So you can use it there. But there are other areas as well. But generally speaking, there's like another way to use images. But yeah. So here's just an example. For example, I'm looking for like a SaaS company, Trello maybe. It's probably going to go to my actual Trello board, which I don't want. Do I have pricing on here? So have you ever seen like examples right here where it's like, all right, Pro is like the most popular, and they'll have like a star like up here in the corner or something like that doesn't move. That's like an example of where, or like a tag that's unique that doesn't change anywhere. But I was just trying to find an example of where like absolute positioning might be used. What other questions do you have?
So you said that you don't use position too much. What do you default to then?
As far as position wise, or
Yeah.
I just use the default positioning. So it defaults to the static, or I'm sorry, yeah, it defaults to static positioning. So yeah.
Got it.
I'm just trying to find one more thing. Products. Yeah. Anyway. So yeah, I highly encourage you to go around and mess with like positioning, like absolute positioning and relative positioning. But yeah, you can just remember that absolute, it's relative to the parent div. Wherever that parent div is, it's relative to that.
I do have another question, Tom, if you got a second.
Yeah.
Are we going to cover like scalability, like, you know, across like how it's used on like mobile versus like desktop and stuff like that?
We're not going to explicitly go over like desktop and mobile design. there's different ethoses out there as whether or not you should design and style for mobile first and then scale back to web. It just depends on the requirements of the project.
For sure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
How, this might be a little bit off topic, but how would you go about creating an app? Like, how long would it take to get on the app market?
That is entirely dependent on what app store you apply, whether it's iOS or Android. I think iOS takes at least a couple of weeks or at least a week, and they're a lot more strict. So they'll reject your application more often than if you send it to the Android Google Store, Google Play Store, whatever it's called.
Okay, thanks. I just had no idea. So.
No, yeah, like you have to get approval, like from, especially if iOS versus Android or Google. So it could take a while. It could take up to a week, 2 weeks, in some cases. All right. So any questions about relative versus absolute? All right. With that, let's move on to pseudo classes. Let me bring up my.
Sorry, one quick thing with the relative absolute. As far as I assume we're going to go over this in a not too long here, but changing the window size and keeping things visually working, is that going to be with the position, or is there other elements that's going to take care of that?
That's more in line with the display. So yeah, we'll cover that. Like when like the window changes have like things like wrap around and
Yeah,
all that. Yeah.
that's the same one looking at like mobile browser versus.
Yeah, it's pretty much, yeah.
That's in window as well, or?
Yeah, so it's you'll be using the display property as well as you can actually target specific window sizes. So like certain elements change based off of the window size.
Okay.
That happened in the meta tag viewport.
I'm sorry?
I mean, don't you just do that with like yeah, right there where it says name viewport and then content width equals device width. Doesn't that just take care of it?
No, you actually have to explicitly, well, it depends on what you want to actually change. So there's certain elements that will change. So here's a site. So if I wanted to change, like there's certain elements that will change, like how it collapses the menu, and like down here, like this is a grid, and then I think it changes to like flex or something. But so like certain elements will change based off of different viewport. So you actually explicitly in your CSS be like, hey, once the viewport gets smaller, all of a sudden make it wrap, make it like do specific things based off of the viewport. All right. So I'm just going to create another couple of files, touch index.html, styles.css, and I'm going to open our code index and styles. Bring this over here, and we're going to just talk about some pseudo classes real quick. So I'm going to do HTML, boilerplate. I'm going to create a header container, div. And again, feel free to follow along. So I'm going to create a class called a header container. And then I'm just going to create a bunch of H1 or H1 tag, H2 tag, H3, H4, H5.
What was the shortcut you used on the keyboard for that?
So I highlighted, so for example, I highlighted like H1 and I do Command D to highlight all the H1s. And now I can just delete and do like H4 or H1. So that's
Awesome. Thank you, Tom.
yep, no problem. All right. So I'm going to open this. There we go. So we have, I'm going to link the style sheets as well. So in my class, header, container, I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to actually not have anything. So a pseudo class is a class that changes the style of whatever element you want based off of different things, based off of you interacting with the actual web page. So right here, this is all just static information, static HTML, but perhaps if I like hover over a specific HTML element, I might want to do something. Or if I click on something, maybe I want it to do something. So there's some pseudo classes. For example, where is it? I'm going to add some more stuff here. ID of title. And then I'm going to add a class of subtitle. So here I've got a bunch of H1 tags. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to target my title. And maybe if when I hover over it, I want it to change the background color and something else. So I can do title : and you can kind of see all these different pseudo classes. There's a bunch of them. Most of them I have no idea what they do, but just know that there's a lot of pseudo classes out there. But I'm going to use the hover pseudo class. So when I hover over the title, maybe I want the background color to change to red. And maybe I want the cursor to, instead of being this little arrow, to be like a different cursor type. So I'm going to say cursor. And let's see all the different types of cursors out there. So I think I saw auto scroll, crosshair, grab. Maybe I want grab. No, grabbing. Yeah, so maybe I want like a crosshair or something like that. So if I refresh this, and now when I hover over the H1 tag, it turns red. Yay, it looks really cool.
I'm so going on the rabbit hole with this.
What's that?
I'm so going to get lost on the rabbit hole going through this.
So
yeah,
maybe
you
I'm
can
gonna
make each field do a different color and just move the mouse up and down and make a rainbow.
yeah. So, for example, maybe on H1, again, maybe it's hovering over it. Now I've made the cursor a pointer, like a little hand, like pointing. But maybe when I click it, I want something else to happen. So that's called an active state. So I do title.active and maybe make the background color pink. And maybe the cursor, instead of pointing, it's grabbing that. It's actually a grabbing. And like the color is white. I think I'm missing something here. All right. So refresh that. Cool. So I'm hovering over it. It's turning red. Now if I click the button, now it's pink and it's turning, and now the H1 color is white, the background color is pink, and the cursor is actually grabbing it. I can do the same thing with, so that's for an ID, but I can do the same thing with an entire class. Subtitle, like hover, background color, purple. So if I do that, refresh it, there we go. And maybe when I hover, I want to change the color to white as well. Pretty cool. Let's see what else. So hover, active state. Let's go ahead and create a couple of links. So I'm going to come over here, my HTML, create another div, and create two links. One that says this is a link with a class of link, and another link called unvisited link, and call it, have a class of unvisited. So if I refresh that, there I've got two links with the basic, with the basic styling of a link. So I'm going to actually target just all links, actually just the link, and say text decoration, none, and the color black. So if I refresh that, this is a link that doesn't have any text decoration in it. All right. So maybe I want to change the first element, or yeah, actually, I'm going to target all the tags. So now both links don't have any text decoration and both colors are black. Excuse me. And maybe I just want to target the very first A tag in this group. So I can do, and I want to change like this background color to, this is a link to like turquoise or something. I can do A, and now I can see all the different pseudo classes, and I'm going to say first child. I'm going to make a background color of aquamarine. And if I refresh that, it only targeted the very first A tag, the very first A tag. I can do the same thing. I think there's A dot last child. I can also target the last child of an element. So if there's a list of another links,
So quick question about that.
yep.
So on the actual page, the background color, so everything that you see is in aquamarine is the container created for the A tag, right? So that's kind of like the box it automatically creates for that. Like I know there's words inside of it, but
Are you talking about?
yeah, so each of, and I'm just getting at like the individual tags, they have their own boxes. That is the size just outside of what the letters is. Okay.
Yep. So if I wanted to add margin to the box of the first child to make that like bigger, I can add like 30 pixels of margin, and this entire link will, or actually, I don't think it will be bigger. Yeah, it's not bigger. It's just added margin. But if I wanted the entire thing to be like the overall aquamarine to be bigger, I can do that.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. So background color, I'm going to just say red for the last child in that link. So I'm able to grab last child, first child. There's plenty of other ones. For example, maybe after, and you can, I believe you can you can tag, you can keep chaining pseudo classes together. So perhaps maybe I've got a list of elements, and I want to grab the last element by doing a tag, the last child, and I want to inject something afterwards, after that. I can do double colon after, and I'm going to add some content to this. This is some more content. And if I refresh this, looks like last child, this is some more content. And it looks like that made another like child element, and it applied that styling to that. It's interesting.
So when you're working with CSS and stuff, there's no like obviously errors that are popping up. So if something is wrong, it just doesn't work. There's not going to be a change. There's no
Right.
like error troubleshooting. Okay.
Correct. So just wanted to show you can add things. You can chain pseudo classes together. Let's actually create something a little more useful that people might find interesting. So I got rid of that. Oh, geez. Let's get rid of. Let's get rid of that as well. All right, here we go. So if you don't know HR, that gives you like a little line, like a little dashed line across whatever. So I've got this button. So I'm going to add some styling to this button. And I'm going to add some pseudo classes to that as well. So I'm going to have a button with a height of 30 pixels, a width of 100 pixels, a background color of turquoise. Why not? I'm going to have it border none because I don't like the default border because this button doesn't, it's just not appealing to me. And I'm going to add some box shadow. Has anybody heard of box shadow before? So I'm going to add some box shadow. So it kind of tells you. So,
Is it just like a drop shadow kind of effect?
Yeah. So 2 pixels. I'm going to make it gray. So if I do that and I refresh this, so right here, it doesn't have any drop shadow, but if I keep adding 2 pixels, there we go. Now I've got some drop shadow.
Oh, that's cool.
But that's very rigid. The shadow is like very defined, which I don't want. So I can actually spread out the shadow over a longer distance. So I'm going to add another element. So now it's a little more faded, like more of a shadow. So by adding 3 elements, you can even add 1 more element. So I'm going to do that. And now it's very defined, which I don't know if I like. That's almost like too much. So I'm just going to add 4. I'm going to make it even more spread out. There, that's, Actually, I'm going to go back. I'm going to actually make it this 4 and make that a little 1. There, that's a little bit better. All right. But on my hover, so when I hover over it, button hover, I'm going to give it an effect. Kind of like it's when I am interacting with it, it's like doing something. So I'm going to do box shadow, 20 pixels, not 20 pixels, 2 pixels, 4 pixels, 6 pixels, and 2 pixels again. And I'm going to make it gray as well. So when I hover over it, the box shadow is going to change. And it's going to get a little bit interesting. So refresh this. Ooh, well, it almost looks like something's happening. And now I'm going to make the cursor change to pointer. So the user knows that they can explicitly interact with this element. Kind of cool, but it's happening too quickly. Like, I don't like that. I want it to like slowly change. So what I'm going to do is add on the main CSS property, I'm going to add a transition effect, and I'm going to target all the elements. So all the selectors. So, what do you call all the properties. And I'm going to say I want it to take 0.5 seconds to change all these properties when I hover over it. And I want it to ease, like transition kind of slowly. So, what happened? Transition, gray, there we go. So now it kind of like slowly raises or slowly adds the drop shadow to it. Let's speed that up a little bit to 0.2 seconds or 200 milliseconds. That's a little bit better. And also, I actually want to transform this. So I can physically move elements on the screen, whichever direction I want. So I want to transform it. And I want to translate the Y, where is it? To -2 pixels. So I want it to move -2 pixels up to make it look like it's actually raising away from the screen and the shadow gets bigger. There we go. So it almost looks like it's like 3D. Any questions on how to? No.
I don't suppose you could combine CSS with JavaScript.
We will be doing that tomorrow and Thursday. Yep. So after it's actually active, I want to change the cursor to, instead of pointing, grabbing. And I want to make the box shadow go back to its original state when I press it. So it kind of looks like it's going down. And I want it to transform the translate Y back down to its original height. So when I hover over it, so now it actually looks like almost like a physical button when I click it. Yep. And just for the hell of it, I'm going to add another pseudo class after. I think we've kind of done this before. Content. This is a button, but you'll see you'll occasionally see pseudo classes like so. HR. Oh, geez. I'm going to do div. And with the content, you can also add in URLs. So instead of adding specific content, maybe after something, I want to add a URL to a specific image, perhaps. I'm actually going to do that. Hello. ID after. Hashtag after. So I can actually specifically add an image to a screen. That's me when I'm coding. I have no idea what's going on. Any questions about pseudo classes and what you can do with them? No questions?
I kind of have a question. I know that like with like Python and stuff like that, like we have libraries. Are there, do you know of any like extensions or anything that we can kind of import into CSS that maybe might kind of add some more kind of cool options or something?
Yeah. There's Bootstrap, and which we'll cover really shortly. But first, I want to try to get through all this before lunch. So if nobody hasn't, does anybody else have any questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
Who's that person in the image that you chose?
Who's that? Has anybody seen Silicon Valley?
I've not seen it. That's why I asked the question.
Oh yeah, sorry.
it's a good show.
It's Big Head. He's like a developer that is, quote, a jack of all trades but a master of none, and he somehow gets promoted to a very high position at a company equivalent to that of Google, and he literally doesn't do anything, and he's not the brightest.
Is it on
Pull your
Netflix?
CSS down for a minute.
I'm sorry.
Go down and thank you.
As far as just designing things, because there's a lot of stuff you can do to the buttons, but like as far as like icons and other things, because I feel like those buttons, like a square doesn't look very good. Do you kind of like design everything for like looking boxy and then go back and maybe replace those icons? Is that more the way to do it? Just kind of functionality first and then specific design aspect later? Or
Generally speaking, you'll have like a designer that has all the icon assets and image assets that you'll have access to when implementing this. So you'll implement those as you're coding.
so flow wise, it'll be like this is all pretty much completely designed on paper from the designer, and then you just kind of plug and go from the.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. And feel free to follow along. I'm going to open up code index.html styles.css. So we're going to go over some grid and Flexbox. Where is it? Pseudo classes. So I'm going to create new HTML file. I'm going to import styles real quick. I'm going to get rid of and I'm going to import, or I'm just going to copy and paste pretty much kind of what I did before. I'm going to create two divs, one that has a class of grid and one has a class of flex, and each div has an H1 tag, H2, H3, etc. So I'm going to, what is it? Open index.html. So with that, I'm actually going to comment out the flex part of it. I want to talk about grid. So there's a couple of ways you can position things on the screen. One of them is grid. One of them is flex. There's a couple of inline block. There's block level elements, but grid and flex Flexbox is becoming more and more popular just because it is more dynamic. So I've got this parent grid class grid, and what I'll want to do is create a display, the display property as grid. And what this will do, so just making the display property grid just adds some like margin to everything. But as you hover over it, you can kind of see like the border of the grid, or like the elements, like that little purple dash line of the grid. But yeah. So with that, I'm going to actually, what is this? I'm going to target all the H1 tag and all the H2 tags in the grid. And I'm going to give it a solid black line, just kind of show you, just so we can distinguish what these are. So we refresh it. Here we go. We have a bunch of H1 or H elements, H tags with a border around it. So for the grid, I think I kind of covered it a couple, like two lessons ago, where you explicitly say the width, how many columns, how many rows of the grid you want. So I can say, hey, grid template columns, and I think there's 5 columns or 4 columns. For example, maybe I want the first column to be 100. The second one, I don't really care, so it's going to be 300 because it's going to be auto fit the screen. The third column is going to be 300 pixels, and the other ones are going to be just auto. So I explicitly want the first column and the third column to have a specific width. So now you can kind of see, you know, H1 tag is only at 100 pixels wide. H2 tag is auto, so it's automatic, dynamically changes the width. So it's 195.59 pixels. 3, I explicitly said I want it to be 300 pixels wide, and these are dynamic as well. So 184 and 184 and 187. So with that,
Hey, Tom, I got a quick question.
Yep.
When you said to auto, is it this taking the measurements from the other pixels that you're setting, or is it the content you're gonna put in there can also adjust it?
I believe that's actually a good question. So if I make this like super long, I think this will automatically get bigger. Yeah. So it automatically gets bigger. So it's dependent on the content that you put into it.
And
Okay,
and what
cool,
happens
thank
if you resize that window? So like if you go full screen on that window, does it?
So yeah,
do they
it's just dynamically. The 2 static ones, H1 and H3, will stay at 100 pixels and 300 pixels, but all the other ones will grow and like change in width. Cool. All right, but with that, so we explicitly said how many columns you want, but maybe we also want to have some rows. So template rows, and let's say we only want 3 rows and explicitly say we want them to be 100 pixels, 100 pixels, and 150 pixels. So if I refresh that, see nothing really changes. But if I hover over it, you can see the 2 other rows beneath it. So this is where grid comes kind of in handy because you can explicitly say what element you want in which grid level. So for example, if I wanted to target grid the H1 on that, and let's say I wanted to start in the second column. So maybe I wanted to move the H1 to the H2 where the H2 is. And I wanted to extend all the way through H3. So I wanted to expand to these two through the H2 and H3 columns. So the second and third column. So I can say grid 1, grid column start. What column do I want it to start at? I want it to start at column 2. And I want it to grid column end at grid column 4, but not inclusive of the column of 4. So if I come over here and refresh this, let's kind of see what happens. Notice how it pushed all the other elements and made it like kind of wrap around to the next available items, the next available row, and this specific grid point. So I can keep doing that. I can move, maybe grid H2 where the H2 tag is. Maybe I want to move the H2 tag right here to the very first column and very first row. So again, I can say grid column start is 1. Let's just see what that looks like. All right, look, but it's not on the row. It's on the second row, which I don't want it to be. So I can do grid row start 1 right there. Cool. So, but all the other elements changed as well. Let's say I want the H3 to start in the 3rd row, end in the 5th row. So I wanted to encapsulate these 2 columns, as well as start and essentially move H3 to be in the lower right-hand corner of the grid. So I can say grid H3, grid column start, grid column start 3, grid column end. I want it to end at 6, but not inclusive of 6. So there's column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, column 5, because H1 is in fact taking up 2 columns, as you can kind of see right there. Grid column end. But the grid row end 3. So if I come down here and refresh it, there we go. Oh, so yeah, grid row end, it would be, I want it to go to the very 4th one. Or wait, grid row start. I want it to be on the 3rd one. There we go. So there we go.
A quick question for the, so the grid, you have a few of them set to auto, so they automatically scale, and it scales anything inside of it. So say you had an image in row 1, number 2, because that one's one of the auto scaling ones. If you had an image in there, then that image would also auto scale if it's set within that grid.
Yeah, it should. Yeah. All right. Let's keep going. That's grid 4. Grid H4. Let's start that in column 1. Grid column start 1. Let's end it. So H4, I want it to start in column 1. I'm sorry, grid column, what is it, H4? Yeah, actually, I want it to start in column 5 and start in row 1 and end in row 3.
Tom, could you move your browser over in front of the HTML and leave the CSS open while we look?
Oh, like so. And there we go. What the hell? Like so. Cool. Might as well just do this. Yeah, there we go. Good call. So grid column start 5, grid row start, I want it to be 1, and grid row end 3. So let's see where the H4 winds up. So notice how H4 starts in column 5 and starts in row 1 as well as row 2, but doesn't encapsulate row 3 because row end is not inclusive. And last, grid H5. We'll grid column start. Let's do 1. Grid column end. Let's end it at 3. Grid row start is 2. And grid row end is 4. So it's should take up all this entire area. So if I refresh that, there we go. And now you can actually align items within there. So you can align self end. So if I do that, watch what happens in H2. So the entire box collapses. Or, for example, H5, justify content, center. You can center everything. Oh, did H5 not center? Oh, justify self, sorry. Justify self, right there, everything center. And you can also justify self as end. Whoop. Like so, to do the very end of the box. Questions about grid?
So when you're define, or like, I don't know what the right terminology, but in styles, when you do .grid H4, why do you have to do .grid H4 and not just H4?
Because in my HTML, I've got specifically here, I've got H4 here and H4 here. So if I did, so these are two separate elements or two separate parent or two separate groups of HTML, and I only want to target this H4 within the grid, within its parent. So I'm doing .grid, so I'm grabbing this class and the parent or the child with an H4 tag within here. That's why I'm doing that.
Okay.
Yep. So let's move on to Flexbox. So I've got a class of Flex. Let's move over to the CSS. There we go.
This isn't as much fun as watering carrots.
So Flex. So I just have borders around that. But now let's try .flex and do display flex. And now flex has flex direction. You can, it defaults to row, or yeah, it defaults to, sorry, I think column. So if I do column and refresh that. So yeah, it defaults to row because everything's in a single row. If I want to change flex direction to column, I can change everything into a column. I can do column reverse, which H5 and H1, everything's going to get reversed like so. Also, I can do, let's do, generally speaking, I just don't even have flex direction. But this is where justify content. So let's actually just go back to the original one. Like so. If I wanted spacing in between everything, I can do space between. Oh, why didn't it do that? There we go. So space between, make sure everything is as spread out as possible. I can even do space evenly, which will make things a little bit evenly spaced, but from the edges of the screen, like so. And as I collapse this, right now, like the display, it's getting smaller and smaller, but maybe I want it to wrap to the new line. So you can even do, there's a selector called, or a property called flex wrap, and you can type in wrap and it'll automatically wrap based off of how wide the elements are. So right now it's not wrapping because those elements don't have a fixed width. But if I do width 200 pixels and come back here, let's see if this works. It might already be somewhat wrapped. See how it's already kind of wrapped a little bit? But as the window grows, it's dynamic. So this is where, you know, window size, if you're using mobile and you're using a smaller mobile window, this makes it a little more easier to read because everything's wrapping. And you can align items just like you are align items, center. So everything's aligned center. Does anybody have any questions about Flexbox and Grid? Nope. All right, I just want to cover one more thing and we'll take a lunch. So I know people are talking about Bootstrap and everything.
Oh, sorry, I did have one quick question.
Oh, yep.
For so it looks like, would it make sense? Because when you were doing the HTML stuff, you were like starting to wrap everything in divs, but it looks like Grid and Flexbox makes that a little bit unnecessary because you can just place them in certain spots in the grid. Would you still want to wrap everything in div just to have ways to point to it, or would that matter? Rather than giving everything a class and referring it to it as a class or an ID and just getting rid of all the divs.
So you'd still need the divs to determine what is going to reside within the box, the flex box, or the grid. So like you'll definitely need a parent div. Are you talking about like if I wanted like something here?
Well, if you referred to say H2 have class subtitle, if you just added a class for grid, could you take out the div, or would you still need that?
Oh no, you would still need this. I'm actually,
because I always get, I see, it's just because I see the CSS is easier to visualize, work with, and see. And this just looks a little bit more like that's just how HTML is.
You'd still need to architect your HTML correctly, because yeah, because Flexbox and Grid, like it's still what is your screen layout will still be determined based off of what is within the parent div. So within the Flexbox and the grid. So your layout will still matter. All right. All right. Let's talk about Bootstrap real quick. So there's a plethora of different CSS libraries out there, or CSS frameworks. Bootstrap's one of the oldest. I think it was developed by Twitter way back like over a decade ago. But there's plenty of other ones. There's Bootstrap, there's Material UI, there's Balma, which is really good, balma.io. And these are essentially, instead of us writing vanilla CSS like this to make a navbar and make everything look pretty, there's already a specific set of design standards and styling standards, and these CSS frameworks think they've got the best design, or it's very easy just to implement a good looking button by just doing something really simple. So there's Bootstrap, Balma, Material UI. There's a bunch of other ones. But let's actually come in here. So
and how do we what's the name of this thing overall to search for different ones?
Just type in best CSS frameworks, I guess. index. So I'm just going to code HTML. So I'm going to do boilerplate. So just like we would import our own style sheets within our HTML, we can import the style sheets of other CSS frameworks. So if I just click home, getting started, right here, we can copy this right here. It's this link, just like we do here with our style sheets. If we had styles.css, we print this in here. We copy and paste this. This links to essentially all the predefined styling of Bootstrap. So if I come over here and literally put this in here, this is all CSS. Notice how it's like root, BS blue, font size, all of that. And this little inside this link where it says min.css, that just minifies it. It just essentially gets rid of all the spaces and breaks within the code, within the CSS, because a computer can parse through this very easily. But if you actually want to see what the actual code looks like, the actual styling, get rid of that min and go to this link. And this is all Bootstrap code, or Bootstrap CSS. So body, margin, font family, HR, and look how long it is. So all this stuff is already predefined for you. So all you have to worry about is putting the correct class name in whatever HTML element you want, and it will display like a good looking button or a nav bar. So I literally just put that link in here. And if I wanted to, for example, so I'm on the documentation, I'm going to go to components, and maybe I wanted to create a form or something. Let's just stick with something simple, buttons. So these are all the different buttons that Bootstrap comes with. So it's got a button tag, the type is a button, and this class button primary, that's what determines the styling of these buttons. So if I come over here and just put button and open index.html and come over here, you can see I've got a button, or a decent looking button, without having to do anything. So it takes a lot of the styling and design work off of your plate. So you don't have to do all the heavy lifting. So because Bootstrap does that for you. There's a plethora of other stuff you can do. Navbar, you can do an entire navbar that's also dynamic. So for example, if I'm just going to copy and paste this code in place of right there and refresh that, and sweet, I've got a navbar. Pretty easy. And you can go ahead and kind of see how everything's working. So if this gets smaller, notice how it automatically does that for me. But obviously this doesn't work right now because I don't have JavaScript incorporated into it. So if I wanted to add that functionality into it, I'm going to go back to home where it says getting started. So I added that link into it, but Bootstrap also comes with JavaScript. So I can add this script tag, you know, down here where it says script right here. I'm going to, in place of that, I'm going to add that, and hopefully this works now. Not quite sure.
Search button looked different.
The search button did. So now notice how when I close it and now I click on it, everything, the dropdown works and everything, because this JavaScript needs to, you need to have JavaScript in here to make this actually clickable and expandable, etc. But what also is kind of nice, if you scroll down further, you can even use some other items But they have this entire starter template for you that you can just literally copy and paste into your as an HTML file. But all the functionality and everything is dependent on the class name. So Navbar dark, background dark. So the BG generally stands for background. You can do all kinds of stuff. So now it's dark. And for like the button, how it's hoverable. So if I come down here and look at the button, this outline element, that's what makes it like hoverable and everything. So if I click that, now how it's just solid green, but if I want it to be hoverable or have an outline, I'm going to have outline, and success determines also the color. So if you just click buttons, components, buttons. So notice how I've got button primary is blue, button secondary is gray, button success is green. That's what I currently have. There's danger, warning, info, light, dark, etc. So maybe I want it to be warning. I want it to be like a yellow, or info. I like info. So if I come back here, refresh, now it's got that like bluish color. So Bootstrap allows you to rapidly create like a decently, I want to say, looking application, because you still have to do some customization, but relatively simply, you can get a Navbar, all kinds of cool stuff in Bootstrap. Breadcrumbs, there's alerts, yeah, popovers. And as this gets more and more, like there's progress bars and all kinds of stuff. There's really cool stuff you can do with Bootstrap. So you can pretty much design an entire application using Bootstrap and not having to do a whole lot of styling. So some companies that still use Bootstrap, like Trello, uses Bootstrap in their application. But yeah.
So when you're using Bootstrap, you're always going to have that link to them, and you're going to get the current copy of their CSS?
I don't know if you'll get the current copy. So right here is the actual current version that I'm using. So Bootstrap 5.0.1. But if they update it, you'll still be using the older version of Bootstrap. And you can.
I don't worry about a client calling me and complaining that all his buttons changed color or something.
No. So a lot of times, like in my old applications, like from last year, like I think I'm on like version 4.6, but they're usually pretty interchangeable. So not like a whole lot will change. But yeah. All right. What
so
question?
as far as if you had a job interview on front end, like would they expect you to know your Bootstrap and have it memorized, or would they want you to write CSS from scratch?
Like you'd put on your resume that you know Bootstrap, various different CSS libraries, but if you're actually interviewing for like an actual front end role, I've heard of all kinds of crazy front end. Like one is like implement a clock and have it actually work. Like have like a clock with all the dials and have it actually like spin and work and look like a clock, all in front end and vanilla HTML and CSS. So I would say they would expect, yeah, I'm not quite sure. I've never had like an explicit front end interview before, but they wouldn't have you probably memorize all of that. No, but as long as you have experience working in it, that's fine.